What if I told you that one of the greatest Formula One drivers of all time almost never made it to a racetrack? That behind Lewis Hamilton's incredible success lies a secret so amazing, it will change how you think about dreams forever? This isn't just another racing story. This is the true tale of how an 8-year-old boy from a tiny council flat, whose family could barely afford food, somehow caught the attention of a Formula One legend who changed everything in secret. For years, people wondered how Lewis Hamilton rose so fast. How did a kid with holes in his shoes and no money become a world champion? The answer involves a mysterious phone call, a hidden benefactor, and one of the most shocking reveals in sports history. You're about to discover the real story behind Lewis Hamilton's impossible journey. A story of sacrifice, belief, and a promise that changed 2 lives forever. But first, let me take you back to where it all began. 8-year-old Lewis Hamilton pressed his face against the cold glass window. His breath made little clouds on the surface as he stared at the most amazing sight he had ever seen. Inside the McLaren Technology Center in Woking, shiny Formula One cars sat like sleeping dragons, red and silver machines that could go faster than anything in the world. "One day, I'll drive those cars," Lewis whispered to his reflection in the glass. The boy's worn sneakers squeaked on the wet pavement. It was October 1993, and the autumn rain had soaked through his thin jacket. But Lewis didn't care about being cold or wet. All he could think about were those beautiful racing cars. Lewis had walked 3 miles from the train station to get here. His dad, Anthony, was working his second job today, fixing computers at an office in London. Anthony worked 3 jobs just to keep food on their table in their tiny flat back in Stevenage. Their refrigerator was almost empty again, and Lewis knew better than to ask for money for the bus, but seeing these cars was worth the long walk. "Hey, kid, you can't be here." Lewis jumped. A big security guard was walking toward him. The man wore a blue uniform and had a serious look on his face. Lewis's heart started beating fast. Was he in trouble? The guard got closer and stopped. Something about this boy was different. The guard had seen lots of kids try to peek at the cars over the years. Most of them just wanted to see something cool and then go home. But this boy's eyes were different. They held a fire the guard had never seen before. The name tag on the guard's shirt read, Marcus Thompson. "What's your name, son?" Marcus asked in a gentler voice. "Lewis Hamilton," the boy said, standing up straight. "I'm going to be a racing driver." Marcus almost laughed out loud. This mixed-race kid with holes in his shoes? In Formula One? It was a sport for rich white boys whose fathers owned companies. Kids like Lewis didn't become racing drivers. The idea seemed crazy. But something stopped Marcus from laughing. Maybe it was the way Lewis looked him right in the eyes when he spoke. Maybe it was how the boy didn't look embarrassed or scared, even though his clothes were too small and his jacket was torn at the elbow. Marcus had worked at McLaren for 15 years. He had met famous drivers and rich team owners, but he had never met anyone who looked more sure of themselves than this 8-year-old boy standing in the rain. "Tell you what, Lewis," Marcus said slowly. "Come back next Saturday. Same time. But don't tell anyone I said you could come, okay?" Lewis's eyes went wide. "Really? You mean it?" "I mean it. But it's our secret." Lewis nodded so hard his wet hair bounced. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." The boy turned and ran toward the road, his feet splashing through puddles. Marcus watched him go and shook his head. What was he thinking? This kid would probably forget all about it by next week. But as Lewis ran, he felt like he was flying. Someone at McLaren wanted to see him again. His dream felt a little bit closer. The 3-mile walk back to the train station felt like nothing. Lewis's mind was racing faster than any Formula One car. He thought about what he would say to Marcus next Saturday. He thought about those shiny racing cars. He thought about driving them around famous racetracks he had seen on TV. By the time Lewis got back to Stevenage, it was getting dark. He climbed the stairs to their council flat on the 3rd floor. The building was old, and the hallway smelled like cooking and cleaning chemicals. Paint was peeling off the walls, and one of the lights was broken. Lewis opened the door to find his stepmother Linda making dinner in their tiny kitchen. She was stirring a pot of pasta, and Lewis could smell that it was just plain noodles again. No sauce, no meat. Just noodles with a little butter. "Where have you been?" Linda asked. She wasn't angry, just worried. Linda was always worried about money and bills and whether they had enough food. "I went to see the racing cars," Lewis said. Linda sighed. She knew about Lewis's dreams, and they scared her. Dreams cost money, and they didn't have any money. Dreams could break a person's heart when they didn't come true. "Lewis, you know we can't afford racing," she said gently. "I know," Lewis said, "but I still want to see the cars." An hour later, Anthony came home from his second job. His shoulders were tired and his hands were dirty from fixing computers all day. But when he saw Lewis at the kitchen table doing homework, Anthony smiled. "How was school today, son?" "Dad, I met someone at McLaren today," Lewis said, his eyes bright. Anthony's heart sank a little. He knew about his son's dreams. He had heard Lewis talk about Formula One drivers like they were superheroes. Anthony wanted to believe in those dreams, but they seemed so far away. How could a boy from their small flat ever become a racing driver? Still, Anthony saw something special in Lewis's eyes. It was the same spark Anthony had felt when he was young, before life got hard and dreams seemed impossible. "Tell me about it," Anthony said, sitting down at the table. Lewis told his father about Marcus the security guard and about coming back next Saturday. Anthony listened carefully. He wanted to protect his son from disappointment, but he also didn't want to crush Lewis's spirit. "We'll see what happens," Anthony said finally. That night, Lewis lay in bed staring at a poster of Ayrton Senna on his wall. Senna was his favorite driver, a man who could make a race car dance like magic. Lewis had saved his lunch money for 2 weeks to buy that poster. "One day, I'll be just like you," Lewis whispered to the poster. The flat was quiet, except for the sound of cars on the street below. In the next room, Lewis could hear Anthony and Linda talking in low voices about bills and work and money. They always talked about money. Lewis closed his eyes and imagined himself in a Formula One car. He could almost feel the steering wheel in his hands and the speed pushing him back in his seat. In his dream, he was racing at Monaco, the most famous track in the world. Thousands of people were cheering for him, but Lewis didn't know that across town. Marcus Thompson was sitting in his own living room, thinking about the boy he had met that day. Marcus had worked in racing for a long time. He knew talent when he saw it, even in an 8-year-old. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed a number he had memorized years ago. "Ron? It's Marcus Thompson from security. I found someone special today. A boy. There's something about him you need to see." The voice on the other end of the phone belonged to Ron Dennis, the boss of McLaren Racing. Ron was one of the most powerful men in Formula One. "What's special about him?" Ron asked. "I can't explain it," Marcus said, "but this kid has something I've never seen before. He told me he's going to be a racing driver, and I actually believed him." Ron Dennis had heard stories like this before. Lots of kids dreamed about racing. Very few had what it took to make those dreams real. "What's his name?" Ron asked. "Lewis Hamilton. He's 8 years old, and he's got more determination than drivers twice his age." There was silence on the phone for a moment. "Bring him by my office next Saturday," Ron said finally. "Let's see what this boy is made of." Marcus hung up the phone and smiled. He had no idea why, but he felt like he had just changed someone's life forever. Back in the council flat, Lewis had fallen asleep with the racing poster still in his sight. He dreamed of speed and victory and crowds cheering his name. He dreamed of making his father proud and showing the world that dreams could come true. Lewis Hamilton had no idea that his life was about to change in ways he could never imagine. He didn't know that powerful people were already talking about him. He didn't know that next Saturday would be the most important day of his young life. All Lewis knew was that he had a dream bigger than his small flat, bigger than his empty pockets, and bigger than what anyone thought was possible for a boy like him. And sometimes, that's all you need to change the world. The next Saturday felt like the longest week of Lewis's life. Every day at school, he thought about going back to McLaren. Every night, he dreamed about those shiny Formula One cars. At breakfast that Saturday morning, Lewis could barely eat his cereal. His stomach was full of butterflies. "You seem excited about something," Linda said, pouring tea for Anthony. "I'm going back to see the racing cars today," Lewis said. Anthony looked up from his newspaper. "Are you sure that guard really meant it? Sometimes adults say things they don't mean." Lewis nodded firmly. "He meant it, Dad. I could tell." Anthony wanted to believe his son, but he also wanted to protect him from getting hurt. Rich people at places like McLaren didn't usually care about kids like them. "I'll walk you to the train station," Anthony said. "But Lewis, if this doesn't work out, it's okay. It doesn't mean your dreams are wrong." Lewis grabbed his father's hand. "It will work out, Dad. I know it will." The train ride to Woking seemed to take forever. Lewis pressed his face against the window, watching houses and fields fly by. His reflection looked back at him, and he practiced what he would say to Marcus. When Lewis arrived at the McLaren Technology Center, Marcus was waiting for him. But Lewis's heart nearly stopped when he saw that Marcus wasn't alone. Standing next to the security guard was a tall man in an expensive suit. His hair was perfectly combed, and his shoes looked like they cost more than Lewis's family spent on food in a month. Lewis recognized him immediately from magazines at the library. It was Ron Dennis, the boss of McLaren Racing. "So you're the boy who thinks he can drive Formula One?" Ron asked, looking down at Lewis. Lewis's mouth felt dry, but his voice came out strong and clear. "Yes, sir. I will drive Formula One." Ron studied the 8-year-old boy carefully. In his 20 years in racing, Ron had met thousands of hopeful kids. Their parents brought them to the factory, hoping someone would notice their children. Most of the time, the kids were just dreamers with rich parents. But something about Lewis was different. Maybe it was the way he stood up straight, even though his shoes had holes in them. Maybe it was how his eyes never looked away, even when talking to one of the most powerful men in motorsport. "Can you read?" Ron asked. "Yes, sir." Ron walked to his car and pulled out a thick book from the back seat. The cover showed drawings of race cars and had big words that Lewis didn't recognize. "This is a book about aerodynamics," Ron said, handing the book to Lewis. "It explains how air moves around race cars and makes them go faster. Read this, all of it. Come back in 2 weeks and tell me what you learned." Lewis took the book with trembling hands. It was heavier than any book he had ever held. The pages were filled with diagrams and big words that looked impossible to understand. "2 weeks?" Lewis asked. "2 weeks," Ron said. "If you're serious about racing, You need to understand how cars work. Not just the driving part, but the science part too. Louis hugged the book to his chest. I'll read it all, sir. Every page. Ron almost smiled. We'll see. As Ron Dennis walked away, Marcus put his hand on Louis's shoulder. That's a hard book, Louis. Even some adults can't understand it. Louis looked up at Marcus with determination burning in his eyes. Then I'll read it twice. On the train ride home, Louis opened the book and started reading. The words were big and complicated. Aerodynamics, downforce, drag coefficient. Louis had never seen most of these words before, but Louis didn't give up. He took out a small notebook and started writing down every word he didn't understand. Home, Anthony found Louis at the kitchen table with the book open and their old dictionary beside him. What's that book, son? Louis told his father about meeting Ron Dennis and about the challenge. Anthony's eyes went wide when he saw the thick book. Louis, this looks like a college book. Are you sure you can understand it? I have to, Dad. This is my chance. Anthony sat down next to his son. Together, they looked up words in the dictionary. Aerodynamics meant how air moves around objects. Downforce was air pressure that pushed race cars down to help them go around corners faster. Night after night, Louis sat at that kitchen table reading. When he found a word he didn't know, he wrote it down. When he didn't understand a sentence, he read it again and again until it made sense. Linda found him reading under his blanket with a flashlight after bedtime. Louis, you need to sleep, she said gently. Just 5 more pages, Louis said. I need to understand this part, about airflow. Linda looked at the book and shook her head. She couldn't understand half the words on the page. But Louis was reading. It like it was a story about his favorite superhero. At school, Louis carried the book everywhere. During lunch, while other kids played football, Louis read about how the shape of a car affected its speed. His teacher, Mrs. Patterson, noticed him reading during recess. What's that book, Louis? Louis showed her the cover. Mrs. Patterson's eyes went wide. This is very advanced, Louis. Where did you get it? A man from McLaren gave it to me. I have to read it all and tell him what I learned. Mrs. Patterson had never seen Louis so focused on anything. Usually he was a good student, but nothing special. Now he was reading a book that would challenge university students. Do you understand it? She asked. Louis nodded. Most of it. The BE parts I don't understand yet. I keep reading until I do. 2 weeks felt like 2 months. But finally, Saturday arrived again. Louis had read the book twice, just like he promised Marcus he would. His notebook was full of notes and drawings. At McLaren, Ron Dennis was waiting in his office. Marcus brought Louis inside the building for the first time. Louis's eyes went wide as he saw real Formula One cars up close. The smell of rubber and metal filled his nose. The sound of engines echoed through the building. Tell me about aerodynamics, Ron said, sitting behind his big desk. For the next 10 minutes, Louis explained everything he had learned. He talked about how air flowed over the cars. He explained why the cars had wings that pushed them down instead of lifting them up. He described how the shape of the car body reduced drag to make it go faster. Ron Dennis and Marcus exchanged glances. This 8-year-old boy was explaining complex engineering concepts that some race car drivers never bothered to learn. How do you know all this? Ron asked. I read the book like you said, and when I didn't understand something, I kept reading until I did. Ron stood up and walked to his window. He looked out at the factory floor where his Formula One cars were being built. There's someone I want you to meet, Ron said finally. They walked through the factory to a small office. Inside, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile was waiting. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she worked with young drivers who showed promise. "Louis," she said, "how would you like to start karting?" Louis's heart started pounding so hard, he too thought everyone could hear it. Karting was the first step to becoming a race car driver. It was where every Formula One driver started. "But we don't have money for that," Louis whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah smiled. "Don't worry about money right now. Someone believes in you, Louis. Someone thinks you have what it takes to become special." Louis looked around the room at these successful adults who were offering to help him. It felt like a dream. "Who?" Louis asked. "Who believes in me?" Sarah and Ron exchanged a look that Louis didn't understand. "You'll find out when the time is." "Right," Sarah said. "For now, just know that someone very important is watching your career. Someone who started just like you did." Louis felt tears in his eyes, but they were happy tears. "Does this mean I can really become a racing driver?" he asked. "It means you can try," Ron said, "but it won't be easy. You'll have to work harder than you've ever worked before. You'll have to be better than everyone else just to get the same chances they get." Louis wiped his eyes and stood up straight. "I'm ready," he said. As they walked back through the factory, Louis couldn't believe what was happening. 2 weeks ago, he was just a boy from Stevenage with an impossible dream. Now, people at McLaren were talking about helping him become a racing driver. But Louis didn't know that in a quiet office upstairs, Sarah was making a phone call to someone very far away. "He's everything you said he would be," Sarah said into the phone. "The boy is special. He read that entire aerodynamics book and understood it better than drivers with years of experience." The voice on the other end of the phone had a slight accent. "Good. Make sure he gets everything he needs, but don't tell him where the help is coming from. Not yet." "When will you tell him?" Sarah asked. "When he's ready? When he's proven that he truly has what it takes to reach the top." Sarah hung up the phone and smiled. Lewis Hamilton had no idea that his mysterious benefactor was one of the greatest racing drivers who ever lived. Someone who knew exactly what it felt like to dream bigger than your circumstances. Someone who was about to change Lewis's life forever. 3 weeks later, Lewis stood at the entrance of Rye House Kart Circuit in Hertfordshire. The smell of burning rubber and racing fuel filled the air. The sound of tiny engines screaming around the track made his heart race with excitement. "Are you ready for this?" Anthony asked, putting his hand on Lewis's shoulder. Lewis nodded, but his hands were shaking. Today was the day he would drive a real racing car for the first time in his life. Sarah Mitchell walked over to them carrying a helmet and racing suit. "These should fit you, Lewis. They're not new, but they'll keep you safe." Lewis put on the IHU helmet. It was too big and wobbled when he moved his head. The racing suit was borrowed from another young driver and had patches sewn on to cover holes. Lewis didn't care. He felt like a real racing driver. Around the paddock, other kids were getting ready to race too, but Lewis quickly noticed something. These other kids had brand new helmets that sparkled in the sun. Their racing suits looked like they had never been worn before. Some of them had professional mechanics working on their karts. Lewis looked at his father, who was reading a basic manual about how kart engines worked. Anthony had been studying for weeks, trying to learn how to help his son. But he still looked confused by all the technical words. "Don't worry about them," Sarah whispered to Lewis. "Racing isn't about having the most expensive equipment. It's about having the most heart." Lewis walked over to his kart. It was small and looked simple compared to the Formula One cars he had seen at McLaren. But to Lewis, it was the most beautiful machine in the world. "Remember what we practiced," Anthony said, kneeling down next to his son. Smooth on the steering wheel. Look where you want to go, not where you are. Lewis had been studying racing videos at the library every day after school. He watched how the best drivers moved their hands and when they pressed the brakes. He had memorized every corner of this track from watching old races on TV. "I'm ready, Dad," Lewis said. Anthony helped Lewis into the cart. The seat was hard and the pedals felt strange under Lewis's feet. But when Sarah started the engine, Lewis felt electricity run through his whole body. The other drivers lined up for the practice session. Lewis was in the back because he had never raced before. Next to him, a boy with perfect gears sneered. "Look who's here," the boy said loudly. "The charity case with the old helmet." Lewis's jaw tightened, but he remembered what his father taught him. "Let your driving do the talking, son." The green flag waved. Lewis pressed the gas pedal and shot forward like he had been launched from a rocket. The cart responded to every tiny movement of his hands. It felt like the machine was part of his body. By the third corner, Lewis had passed 2 other drivers. By the end of the first lap, he had passed 5 more. The crowd around the track started to notice. "Who is that kid in the old helmet?" someone asked. Lewis couldn't hear them. All he could hear was the engine singing and the wind rushing past his helmet. For the first time in his life, Lewis felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Chai! The 5th lap, Lewis was in 3rd place. By the 10th lap, he was in 2nd. On the final lap, he made a move that made everyone gasp. The leader tried to block him, but Lewis went to the inside of the corner, where nobody expected him to fit. The 2 carts were so close, their wheels almost touched. Lewis squeezed through and took the lead. Lewis Hamilton won his first ever race. As he crossed the finish line, Lewis couldn't believe it. He had beaten kids who had been racing for years, kids with better equipment and more money. In the paddock, Marcus Thompson watched through binoculars from a hill overlooking the track. He had driven an hour to see Lewis race. Now he was on his phone again. "You need to see this," Marcus said into the phone. "The boy just won his first race ever. He's not just good, he's special. Really special." The voice on the other end of the phone sounded pleased. "How special?" He made moves today that drivers with 10 years of experience wouldn't try. And they all worked. Lewis climbed out of his cart with tears streaming down his face. But they were happy tears. "Dad! Dad! Did you see what happened?" Lewis shouted, running to Anthony. Anthony picked up his son and spun him around. "I saw everything. I'm so proud of you." For the first time in years, Anthony felt like maybe dreams really could come true. After the race, other parents came over to congratulate them. But Lewis noticed something else. Some of the parents were whispering and pointing at him. "How can he afford to race here?" one mother asked quietly. "Someone must be paying for him," another parent replied. "Kids like that don't have money for karting." Lewis pretended not to hear, but the words hurt. Even when he won, some people thought he didn't belong. That night at home, Lewis couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt like he was still in the cart, flying around the track. But through the thin walls of their flat, Lewis could hear Anthony and Linda talking in the kitchen. "The racing is getting expensive," Linda said. "Even with the help we're getting, we can't afford much more." "We'll find a way," Anthony replied. "Lewis has something special. I saw it today." "But what if we can't keep up? What if the help stops? Coming?" Lewis pulled his pillow over his head. He didn't want to think about the racing stopping. Today had been the best day of his life. The next weekend, Lewis was back at the track. This time, he met a young mechanic named Jamie Stevens who offered to help work on his cart. "Why would you help me?" Lewis asked. "You don't even know me." Jamie smiled and looked around to make sure no one was listening. "Because I believe in you, and because someone very important believes in you too." "Who?" Lewis asked, for what felt like the 100th time. Jamie winked. "Someone who knows what it's like to start with nothing. Someone who had to fight for every chance they got. You'll meet them someday." "When?" "When you're ready. When you've proven you have what it takes to go all the way to the top." Lewis raced every weekend for the rest of the season. He didn't win every race, but he won most of them. Other teams started trying to recruit him, offering him better equipment and more support. But every time someone approached Lewis or his father, Sarah Mitchell appeared. "Lewis is exactly where he needs to be," she would say firmly. "His development is being handled very carefully." "By who?" the other team managers would ask. Sarah would just smile. "By someone who knows what they're doing." As the season went on, Lewis got faster and more confident. But he also noticed something else. No matter where they raced, Marcus Thompson seemed to be there, watching from a distance, always making phone calls, always reporting to someone. One day, after a particularly good race, Lewis asked Sarah directly, "Who is helping me? Who is paying for all this?" Sarah looked at Lewis carefully. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I want to thank them, and because I want to understand why they chose me." Sarah smiled. "They chose you because they see something in you that's very rare. They see a champion." "But who are they?" "Someone who started exactly where you started. Someone who knows that talent has nothing to do with how much money your family has." That night, Lewis lay in bed thinking about Sarah's words. Somewhere out there was a person who believed in him enough to change his life. Someone who understood what it felt like to dream bigger than your circumstances. Lewis didn't know that far away, in a house much bigger than his small flat, his mysterious benefactor was watching videos of Lewis's races. The person smiled as they watched Lewis make impossible moves look easy. "The boy is ready for the next level," the person said to an assistant. "It's time to move him up to cars." Lewis Hamilton had no idea that his life was about to change again. He had no idea that his mysterious helper was one of the most famous racing drivers in the world. Someone who had fought the same battles Lewis was fighting now. Someone who was about to reveal themselves in the most surprising way possible. 3 years had passed since Lewis first sat in a kart. Now, 11 years old, he was dominating junior, karting across Britain. His bedroom wall was covered with trophies and certificates. He had just won the British Cadet Karting Championship, beating kids who had been racing twice as long as him. But success came with a heavy price. Lewis walked into their flat after school to find Anthony sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread everywhere. Bills, bank statements, and racing invoices covered every inch of space. Anthony's face looked older and more tired than Lewis had ever seen it. "Dad? What's wrong?" Anthony looked up and tried to smile, but Lewis could see the worry in his eyes. "Nothing, son. Just paying some bills." But Lewis wasn't fooled. He could see the red stamps on some of the papers that said "Final Notice." He could see that the racing costs were getting bigger every month, even with the mysterious help they received. That night, Lewis couldn't sleep. Through the thin walls, he heard Anthony on the phone in the kitchen. Lewis crept to his bedroom door and listened. "I can't keep doing this," Anthony said, his voice breaking. "I'm working 4 jobs now, and we still can barely afford food. The racing costs keep going up. Lewis needs better equipment, better coaching, better everything. Maybe it's time to accept that this dream is too expensive. Lewis felt his heart shatter into pieces. "I know he's talented," Anthony continued, "but talent doesn't pay bills. Maybe Lewis needs to find a normal hobby. Maybe I've been selfish letting him chase this impossible dream." Lewis ran back to his bed and cried into his pillow. He had been so focused on winning races that he hadn't seen how much his family was suffering. All this time, he thought he was making his father proud. Instead, he was destroying his family's life. The next morning at breakfast, Lewis could barely look at Anthony. His father had dark circles under his eyes, and his hands shook from exhaustion. "Dad," Lewis said quietly, "I want to quit racing." Anthony dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the floor, sending pieces everywhere. "What? Why would you say that?" Lewis felt tears building in his eyes. "Because I heard you last night. I know we can't afford it. I know I'm hurting our family." Anthony stared at his son in shock. For a moment, he saw his own broken dreams reflected in Lewis's eyes. All those years ago, Anthony had wanted to be an engineer, but life got in the way. Bills got in the way. Reality got in the way. But then Anthony remembered something. He remembered the 8-year-old boy who pressed his face against the McLaren window and declared he would drive Formula One cars. He remembered the fire in Lewis's eyes that had never gone out, not once in 3 years. "No," Anthony said firmly, kneeling down in front of his son. "We don't quit. Ever. You have something special, Lewis. Something that can't be taught or bought. We'll find a way. But the money is just money. Your dreams are worth more than money." That weekend at Brands Hatch Circuit, Lewis felt heavy and sad as he prepared for qualifying. Usually, racing made him feel alive and free. Today, it felt like a burden. His lap times were slow. His mind wasn't focused. Other drivers started passing him in practice, kids he normally beat easily. Sarah Mitchell noticed immediately. After the session, she pulled Lewis aside. "What's wrong? You're driving like you don't want to be here." Lewis looked down at his feet. He told Sarah everything about hearing his father's phone call, about the money problems, about wanting to quit so his family could have a normal life. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she listened. When Lewis finished talking, she was quiet for a long moment. "Lewis," she said finally, "can you keep a secret? A very important secret?" Lewis nodded. "Your racing isn't costing your family as much as you think. Yes, your father works hard and makes sacrifices, but someone has been helping with the major costs. Someone has been paying for your engines, your entry fees, your equipment. Your family doesn't know because this person wanted to help quietly." Lewis's eyes went wide. "Who? Who would do that?" "I can't tell you their name yet, but I can tell you this. They know exactly what it feels like to struggle. They grew up poor too. They had to fight for every opportunity, just like you're fighting. Now, why are they helping me?" Sarah smiled through her tears. "Because they see something in you that reminds them of themselves when they were young. They don't want money to stop real talent." Lewis felt a weight lift off his shoulders, but he was still confused. If someone is helping, why is my dad still struggling? Because even with help, racing is expensive, and because your father is proud, he wants to contribute, to feel like he's earning your success. The helper respects that. That afternoon, Lewis found an envelope slipped under their flat door. Inside was enough money to cover their rent for 3 months, and a note written in neat handwriting. "To Anthony Hamilton, your son is extraordinary. Please don't let financial worry dim his light. The world needs to see what Lewis can do. Believer in dreams. Anthony stared at the letter with tears streaming down his face. Who would do this? Who cares this much about a boy they've never met? Lewis looked at the letter and thought about Sarah's words. Someone who grew up poor. Someone who had to fight for opportunities. Someone who saw themselves in Lewis. I don't know, Dad, but maybe we don't need to know right now. Maybe we just need to say thank you and keep working hard. Anthony hugged his son tightly. You're right. Whoever this person is, they believe in you. And so do I. That night, Lewis lay in bed staring at his racing trophies. For the first time, in weeks, he felt hopeful again. Somewhere out there was a person who understood his struggles. Someone who was helping him chase his dreams without asking for anything in return. Lewis didn't know that in a hotel room across town, his mysterious benefactor was reading a report about Lewis's recent struggles. The person's assistant had explained about the family's financial stress and Lewis's desire to quit. Increase the support, the person said immediately. But keep it quiet. The boy can't know yet. He needs to prove himself first, to show he has the strength to handle success. When will you reveal yourself? The assistant asked. The person looked out the window at the racing circuit where Lewis would compete tomorrow. Soon. When he's ready for the next big step. When he's proven that he truly has champion's heart, not just champion's speed. Lewis fell asleep that night, dreaming of racing cars again for the first time in weeks. He had no idea that his mysterious helper was closer than he thought. He had no idea that very soon everything would change in ways he could never imagine. The person who had been watching him, helping him, believing in him, was about to step out of the shadows. And when they did, Lewis would finally understand that dreams really can come true in the most unexpected ways. 2 years later, 13-year-old Lewis stood in the garage at Brands Hatch Circuit, staring at his new racing car. It wasn't a kart anymore. It was a real Formula Renault car with 4 wheels, a proper cockpit, and an engine that sounded like thunder. Lewis was moving up to Formula Renault, the first real step toward Formula One, but he quickly learned that this level was completely different from karting. The other drivers came from wealthy families with unlimited budgets. They had private coaches, professional mechanics, and spare cars in case something went wrong. Their fathers owned businesses or had made millions in banking. Lewis still lived in the same small flat in Stevenage. He still wore clothes from charity shops under his racing suit. But on the track, none of that mattered. On the track, Lewis was still faster than almost everyone. In the garage next to Lewis, a rich boy named Sebastian Hartley was getting help from 3 professional mechanics. Sebastian's father owned a chain of luxury hotels and could afford the best of everything. Sebastian looked over at Lewis's small team and sneered. "Look who's here," Sebastian said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The charity case from Stevenage. How much is McLaren paying to keep you racing?" Lewis's jaw tightened, but he remembered his father's advice. Don't let them see they hurt you. Let your driving do the talking. Other drivers laughed at Sebastian's comment. Lewis felt his face get hot with embarrassment, but he said nothing. He had learned that words were useless here. Only lap times mattered. When qualifying started, Lewis climbed into his car with fire in his eyes. The green flag waved, and Lewis shot out of the garage like a rocket. By his 3rd lap, Lewis had set the fastest time. By his 5th lap, he had beaten that time. When qualifying ended, Lewis was on pole position, first place on the starting grid. Sebastian finished 8th. On race day, the tension was thick in the air. Lewis sat in his car on the starting grid, surrounded by drivers who had been racing cars for years. Some of them were 17 or 18 years old. Lewis was still just 13. The race started, and immediately 3 cars tried to pass Lewis at the first corner. Lewis held his ground, but by the second corner, he had dropped to 3rd place. "Stay calm," Lewis told himself. "Be patient." For the first 5 laps, Lewis followed the leaders, studying their lines, learning where they were strong and where they made mistakes. Then, on lap 6, Lewis saw his chance. The leader made a small error coming out of a corner. Lewis was there, instantly diving to the inside and taking 2nd place. The crowd gasped. The move was so quick and precise that it looked effortless. 3 laps later, Lewis was in the lead. By the end of the race, Lewis had won by 12 seconds. As he climbed out of his car, the other drivers stared in disbelief. How had a 13-year-old beaten them so easily? In the crowd, Marcus Thompson watched with binoculars, just like he had been doing for 5 years. He was on his phone again, making his regular report. "He's ready," Marcus said. "The boy isn't just fast anymore. He's learning racecraft. He's thinking like a champion." The voice on the other end sounded pleased. "How much longer before he moves to Formula 3? "Maybe 1 more season. But I think he could handle it now if we wanted to push him. No rushing. Let him develop naturally. The best drivers aren't made quickly." After the race, journalists surrounded Lewis. Most of them had never seen a 13-year-old drive with such skill and maturity. "How does it feel to win against much older drivers?" one reporter asked. Lewis thought carefully before answering. "It feels like proof that age doesn't matter if you work hard enough. And it feels like proof that dreams don't care where you come from." That quote appeared in newspapers across Britain the next morning. Suddenly, Lewis wasn't just a racing driver. He was becoming a symbol. Kids from working-class families started wearing T-shirts with Lewis's name on them. Parents pointed to Lewis as proof that their children could achieve anything. But with fame came new pressure. Racing teams started offering Lewis huge contracts to switch from his current team. They promised better cars, more support, and paths straight to Formula 1. The offers were tempting. Some teams were offering more money than Anthony made in 5 years of working. "What do you think, son?" Anthony asked one evening as they looked at a pile of contracts on their kitchen table. Lewis studied the papers carefully. The offers were amazing, but something felt wrong. "I want to stay with our team," Lewis said finally. "They believed in me when no one else would. Sarah and Marcus and everyone at McLaren. They took a chance on me when I was just a kid with a dream." Anthony smiled. His son wasn't just fast and smart. He was loyal. "But some of these offers could set us up for life," Anthony said gently. "Money isn't everything, Dad. You taught me that. The right people matter more than the right amount of money." That night, Lewis received another letter. This one was different from all the others. Instead of just money or encouragement, it was an invitation, printed on expensive paper. Lewis Hamilton is cordially invited to visit McLaren Technology Center for a special meeting regarding his future. Please come alone. Saturday, 10 a.m. Lewis showed the letter to Sarah the next day at the track. "Should I go?" Lewis asked. Sarah smiled, and for the first time, Lewis saw something new in her expression. It looked like excitement mixed with nervousness. "Yes," she said. "It's time." "Time for what?" "Time for you to meet the person who has been helping you all these years. Time for you to understand why someone believed in you from the very beginning." Lewis felt his heart start racing faster than any car engine. "You mean I'm finally going to find out who it is?" Sarah nodded. 5 years ago, a very special person saw something in you that reminded them of themselves. They've been watching every race, reading every report, making sure you had every opportunity to succeed. "Who is it?" Lewis whispered. "Someone who knows exactly what it feels like to start with nothing. Someone who had to fight their way to the top against impossible odds. Someone who became one of the greatest racing drivers who ever lived." Lewis stared at Sarah with wide eyes. One of the greatest racing drivers who ever lived? Who could that be? And why would someone so important care about a boy from Stevenage? "Tomorrow," Sarah said, "you'll have all your answers." That night, Lewis couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine who his mysterious helper could be. Someone great. Someone who understood struggle. Someone who saw potential in an 8-year-old boy with holes in his shoes. Lewis had no idea that across town, his benefactor was preparing for the most important meeting of both their lives. The person who had changed everything for Lewis was finally ready to reveal themselves. And when they did, Lewis would discover that dreams really do come true in the most amazing ways possible. Lewis walked through the doors of McLaren Technology Center with his hands shaking. He had been here many times before, but today felt different. Today, he would finally learn the truth about who had been helping him for 5 long years. Marcus Thompson met Lewis at the entrance with a smile bigger than Lewis had ever seen. "Today's the day, Lewis," Marcus said. "Are you ready?" Lewis nodded, but his voice came out as a whisper. "I think so." They walked through corridors Lewis had never seen before, past offices with glass walls where important-looking people worked on computers, past rooms full of Formula One car parts that sparkled under bright lights. Finally, they stopped at a large wooden door with a sign that read, "Executive Conference Room." "Go ahead," Marcus said. "They're waiting for you." Lewis pushed open the door and gasped. Around a huge table sat some of the most powerful people in motorsport. He recognized Ron Dennis at the head of the table. Sarah Mitchell was there too, smiling at him with tears in her eyes. But Lewis's heart nearly stopped when he saw who else was in the room. At the far end of the table sat a man Lewis had only seen in magazines and on television. A man with piercing eyes and scars on his face from a terrible racing accident years ago. A man who had won 3 Formula One World Championships and was considered one of the bravest drivers who ever lived. It was Niki Lauda. Lewis's mouth fell open. He had watched Niki Lauda's races on old videos at the library. He knew the story of how Lauda almost died in a fiery crash at the Nürburgring in 1976, then came back just 6 weeks later to race again. "Sit down, Lewis," Ron Dennis said kindly. Lewis took a seat, his hands still trembling. He couldn't believe Niki Lauda was in the same room as him. "Lewis," Ron began, "for 5 years, you've been wondering who has been helping your career. Who paid for your karting? Who covered your expenses? Who made sure money was never a barrier to your dreams?" Lewis nodded, unable to speak. Niki Lauda leaned forward in his chair. When he spoke, his Austrian accent was thick, but his words were clear. "It was me, Lewis." The room went completely silent. Lewis stared at the legendary driver in complete shock. "But why?" Lewis finally whispered. Lauda's expression softened, and for a moment, Lewis saw past the tough exterior to something gentler underneath. "Because 40 years ago, I was you," Lauda said quietly. "I came from a middle-class family in Austria. My father wanted me to be a businessman, not a racing driver. he refused to support my racing. I had to take out loans, work extra jobs, and fight for every single opportunity. Lewis felt tears building in his eyes. When Ron told me about an 8-year-old boy who reminded him of a young me, I had to help. I remembered what it felt like to have talent, but no money. I remembered how hard it was to prove myself when everyone said I didn't belong. "You've been watching me all this time?" Lewis asked. Lauda smiled for the first time. "Every single race. I've read every report from Marcus. I've watched videos of your driving. I've seen not just your speed, but your character, the way you handle pressure, the way you treat your team, the way you never give up, even when things get difficult." Ron Dennis slid a thick document across the table toward Lewis. "Lewis, McLaren wants to offer you a full development contract. We'll support your career all the way to Formula One. You'll have the best coaches, the best equipment, and a clear path to our Formula One team. Time for you to understand why someone believed in you from the very beginning." Lewis felt his heart start racing faster than any car engine. "You mean I'm finally going to find out who it is?" Sarah nodded. 5 years ago, a very special person saw something in you that reminded them of themselves. They've been watching every race, reading every report, making sure you had every opportunity to succeed. "Who is it?" Lewis whispered. "Someone who knows exactly what it feels like to start with nothing. Someone who had to fight their way to the top against impossible odds. Someone who became one of the greatest racing drivers who ever lived." Lewis stared at Sarah with wide eyes. One of the greatest racing drivers who ever lived? Who could that be? And why would someone so important care about a boy from Stevenage? "Tomorrow," Sarah said, "you'll have all your answers." That night, Lewis couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine who his mysterious helper could be. Someone great. Someone who understood struggle. Someone who saw potential in an 8-year-old boy with holes in his shoes. Lewis had no idea that across town, his benefactor was preparing for the most important meeting of both their lives. The person who had changed everything for Lewis was finally ready to reveal themselves. And when they did, Lewis would discover that dreams really do come true in the most amazing ways possible. Lewis walked through the doors of McLaren Technology, center with his hands shaking. He had been here many times before, but today felt different. Today, he would finally learn the truth about who had been helping him for 5 long years. Marcus Thompson met Lewis at the entrance with a smile bigger than Lewis had ever seen. "Today's the day, Lewis," Marcus said. "Are you ready?" Lewis nodded, but his voice came out as a whisper. "I think so." They walked through corridors Lewis had never seen before, past offices with glass walls where important-looking people worked on computers, past rooms full of Formula One car parts that sparkled under bright lights. Finally, they stopped at a large wooden door with a sign that read, "Executive Conference Room." "Go ahead," Marcus said. "They're waiting for you." Lewis pushed open the door and gasped. Around a huge table sat some of the most powerful people in motorsport. He recognized Ron Dennis at the head of the table. Sarah Mitchell was there too, smiling at him with tears in her eyes. But Lewis's heart nearly stopped when he saw who else was in the room. At the far end of the table sat a man Lewis had only seen in magazines and on television. A man with piercing eyes and scars on his face from a terrible racing accident years ago. A man who had won 3 Formula One World Championships and was considered one of the bravest drivers who ever lived. It was Niki Lauda. Lewis's mouth fell open. He had watched Niki Lauda's races on old videos at the library. He knew the story of how Lauda almost died in a fiery crash at the Nürburgring in 1976, then came back just 6 weeks later to race again. "Sit down, Lewis," Ron Dennis said kindly. Lewis took a seat, his hands still trembling. He couldn't believe Niki Lauda was in the same room as him. "Lewis," Ron began, "for 5 years, you've been wondering who has been helping your career. Who paid for your karting? Who covered your expenses? Who made sure money was never a barrier to your dreams?" Lewis nodded, unable to speak. Niki Lauda leaned forward in his chair. When he spoke, his Austrian accent was thick, but his words were clear. "It was me, Lewis." The room went completely silent. Lewis stared at the legendary driver in complete shock. "But why?" Lewis finally whispered. Lauda's expression softened, and for a moment, Lewis saw past the tough exterior to something gentler underneath. "Because 40 years ago, I was you," Lauda said quietly. "I came from a middle-class family in Austria. My father wanted me to be a businessman, not a racing driver. He refused to support my racing. I had to take out loans, work extra jobs, and fight for every single opportunity." Lewis felt tears building in his eyes. "When Ron told me about an 8-year-old boy who reminded him of a young me, I had to help. I remembered what it felt like to have talent, but no money. I remembered how hard it was to prove myself when everyone said I didn't belong." "You've been watching me all this time?" Lewis asked. Lauda smiled for the first time. "Every single race. I've read every report from Marcus. I've watched videos of your driving. I've seen not just your speed, but your character. The way you handle pressure, the way you treat your team, the way you never give up, even when things get difficult." Lewis couldn't breathe. This was the moment he had dreamed about since he was 8 years old. But it felt too big, too incredible to be real. "There's one condition," Lauda said, his voice becoming serious again. "Anything," Lewis said immediately. "You must promise me something very important. When you make it to Formula One, and you will make it, you must never forget where you came from. You must help other kids who dream the way you dreamed. Kids who have talent but no money. Kids who need someone to believe in them." Lewis looked around the room at these successful people who had chosen to believe in him. He thought about his father working 4 jobs. He thought about Linda's sacrifices. He thought about all the kids who had written him letters saying he was their hero. "I promise," Lewis said, his voice strong and clear. "I promise I'll never forget, and I'll always help others who need a chance." Lauda stood up and walked around the table. He put his hand on Lewis's shoulder. "Then welcome to the McLaren family, Lewis Hamilton. Your real journey is just beginning." Lewis felt tears streaming down his face, but he didn't care. After 5 years of wondering, he finally understood. One of the greatest racing drivers in history had seen something special in him, had believed in him before anyone else did. "Why? Didn't you tell me before?" Lewis asked. "Because you needed to prove yourself first," Lauda explained. "You needed to show that you had not just speed, but the heart of a champion. You needed to demonstrate that you could handle pressure, disappointment, and success. Now I know you can." Sarah Mitchell handed Lewis a pen. "The contract makes you an official McLaren development driver. You'll move up to Formula 3 next year, then GP2, then Formula 1. Lewis took the pen with shaking hands. As he signed his name, he thought about the 8-year-old boy who had pressed his face against this very building's window 5 years ago. "Thank you," Lewis said to Lauda. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else would." Lauda shook Lewis's hand, "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you win your first Formula One race. Thank me when you become world champion. Thank me when you help the next young driver who needs a chance." As the meeting ended, Lewis walked out of McLaren feeling like he was floating on air. Marcus walked with him to the parking lot where Anthony was waiting in their old car. "How did it go?" Anthony asked nervously. Lewis looked at his father with the biggest smile of his life. "Dad, you're looking at McLaren's newest development driver, and you're never going to believe who's been helping us all these years." Anthony's eyes filled with tears as Lewis told him everything about Niki Lauda, about the contract, about the promise to help other kids chase their dreams. "I'm so proud of you, son," Anthony said, hugging Lewis tightly. "Not just because you're going to be a Formula One driver, but because of the man you're becoming." That night, Lewis lay in bed holding his signed contract. He thought about how far he had come from that rainy day when he first saw the Formula One cars. He thought about Niki Lauda taking a chance on him when he was just a boy with a dream. But most of all, Lewis thought about his promise. Someday, when he made it to the top, he would find other kids like him. Kids with big dreams and small bank accounts. Kids who needed someone to believe in them. Lewis Hamilton had finally learned who his guardian angel was. Now it was time to become someone else's guardian angel. The boy from Stevenage was on his way to Formula One, and nothing would ever be the same again. 2 years later, 15-year-old Lewis Hamilton sat in his Formula 3 car at the Nürburgring in Germany. This was the same track where his mentor, Niki Lauda, had almost died in 1976. Today, it would be the most important race of Lewis's life. Scouts from every Formula One team were watching from the grandstands. Ferrari, Mercedes, BMW, and all the others had heard about the young British driver who was winning everything he entered. This race would decide if Lewis was ready for the final step before Formula One. But Lewis felt the pressure weighing on him, like a heavy blanket. At home in Stevenage, things were still difficult. Even with McLaren's support and Niki Lauda's secret help, the costs of racing at this level were enormous. Anthony was now working 5 different jobs just to contribute what he could. "Maybe you should think about school more seriously," Linda had suggested gently the week before. "Racing is so uncertain. What if it doesn't work out?" Lewis knew she was worried about their future. Even though he was winning races, Formula One still seemed far away. Only a few drivers made it to the top level each year, and Lewis was competing against boys who had unlimited money and support. The morning of the race, disaster struck. During the final practice session, Lewis's car suffered a massive engine failure. The motor exploded in a cloud of smoke and fire, sending Lewis sliding sideways into the tire barriers at 120 miles per hour. Lewis climbed out of the destroyed car, shaken but unhurt. But when he looked at the twisted metal that used to be his race car, his heart sank. "The car is completely destroyed," his team manager said grimly. "We don't have a spare. You might have to miss the race." Lewis sat in the medical center with his head in his hands. This was supposed to be his moment to prove he belonged at the next level. All the Formula One scouts were here. All the important people who could change his life were watching. And now, he might not even get to race. Anthony found his son there an hour later, still sitting alone on the medical bed. "Lewis, what's wrong?" Lewis looked up at his father with tears in his eyes. "The car is destroyed, Dad. I can't race. This was my chance, and it's gone." Anthony sat down beside his son. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Do you remember what you told me when you were 8 years old?" Anthony asked finally. Lewis shook his head. "You said, 'Dad, I don't just want to be a racing driver. I want to be the best racing driver who ever lived." "Do you still believe that?" Lewis looked at his father. Despite everything, the money problems, the sacrifices, the long hours, the constant worry, Anthony's faith in him had never wavered, not once in 7 years. "Yes," Lewis said quietly, "I still believe it." Then we find another car. For the next 2 hours, Anthony and Lewis's team manager worked the phone, calling every contact they had. Most teams said no immediately. Their spare cars were too valuable to risk with an unknown 15-year-old. Finally, with just 1 hour before the race, a miracle happened. A German team that wasn't even competing offered Lewis their backup car. It was older than Lewis's usual car and painted in unfamiliar colors. Lewis had never driven it before, and there was no time for practice. "This is impossible," someone said as Lewis squeezed into the strange cockpit. "You can't learn a new car in 1 hour." Lewis pulled on his helmet and looked out at the track where Niki Lauda had nearly lost his life fighting for his dreams. Then, "I'll do the impossible," Lewis said. The race started with Lewis in last place, 20th out of 20 cars. The other drivers had been practicing all weekend. Lewis was driving a car he had never seen before. But something magical happened when the green flag waved. Lewis shot forward like he had been driving this car his entire life. By the end of the first lap, he had passed 4 cars. By lap 5, he was in 10th place. The crowd couldn't believe what they were seeing. In the grandstands, Formula One team managers were pulling out their phones, calling their bosses. "You need to see this kid," one scout said into his phone. "He's driving a car he's never seen before and making it look easy." By lap 15, Lewis was in 5th place. By lap 20, he was 3rd. With 10 laps to go, he was running 2nd and closing fast on the leader. The leader was Sebastian Hartley, the same rich boy who had mocked Lewis 2 years earlier. Sebastian had the best car, the best team, and years of experience at this track. But Lewis was faster. With 5 laps remaining, Lewis caught up to Sebastian. For 3 laps, they raced wheel to wheel, neither giving an inch. The crowd was on its feet, screaming with excitement. On the final lap, Lewis made a move that people would talk about for years. Coming into the last corner, Sebastian moved to block Lewis's usual passing line. But Lewis had studied this corner for hours after his crash. He knew something Sebastian didn't. Lewis swung his car to the outside, where the track was dirty, and no one ever tried to pass. It was dangerous and almost impossible. The car slid sideways as Lewis fought for grip on the dusty surface. For a moment, it looked like Lewis would crash again, but somehow, impossibly, Lewis held on. He shot past Sebastian on the outside and crossed the finish line first. Lewis Hamilton had won the most important race of his young career. As Lewis climbed out of the unfamiliar car, he was surrounded by journalists and team managers. Everyone wanted to know how a 15-year-old had just driven one of the greatest races they had ever seen. "How did you do that?" a reporter asked. "How did you win in a car you'd never driven before?" Lewis thought about his answer carefully. He thought about his father working 5 jobs. He thought about Linda's worried face. He thought about Niki Lauda believing in him when no one else would. "I remembered that I'm not just racing for me," Lewis said. "I'm racing for every kid who's been told their dreams are too big. I'm racing for my family, who sacrificed everything to get me here. And I'm racing to prove that where you start doesn't matter. What matters is how hard you're willing to fight." In the crowd, Niki Lauda watched with tears in his eyes. Ron Dennis was already on his phone with McLaren's Formula One team. "Fast track. Him," Ron said. "This boy is ready for Formula One. More than ready." That night, Lewis received the phone call that changed everything. Lewis, Ron Dennis, said, "Pack your bags. Next year, you're going to be a Formula One driver." Lewis dropped the phone and started crying. After 7 years of dreaming, after all the struggles and doubts and impossible moments, he had done it. Anthony found him sitting on their small couch, holding the phone and crying happy tears. "What happened?" Anthony asked. "Dad," Lewis said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I'm going to be in Formula One. We made it. We actually made it." Anthony hugged his son tighter than he ever had before, the boy who had pressed his face against. The McLaren window 8 years ago was about to become a Formula One driver. But Lewis's greatest challenge was still ahead of him. Formula One wasn't just about being fast. It was about handling pressure unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was about representing his family, his community, and everyone who had believed in him. Lewis Hamilton was about to step onto the biggest stage in motorsport. And when he did, the whole world would finally see what Niki Lauda had seen in an 8-year-old boy with impossible dreams. The journey from nothing to everything was almost complete. March 18, 2007. Albert Park, Melbourne, Australia. 22-year-old Lewis Hamilton sat in his silver McLaren Formula One car, waiting for the most important moment of his life. The Australian Grand Prix was about to begin, and Lewis was about to make history as the first black driver to compete in Formula One. The weight of the moment crashed over him like a giant wave. Every struggle, every sacrifice, every person who had believed in him had led to this exact second. "Radio check, Lewis," came the voice of his race engineer in his earpiece. "Loud and clear," Lewis responded, his voice steady despite his heart beating like a drum. As Lewis drove slowly to the starting grid, he looked up at the grandstands filled with 100,000 people. Somewhere in those stands sat Anthony, wearing a McLaren shirt and crying tears of pride. Next to him was Linda, who had never missed believing in Lewis's dreams, even during the hardest times. In the McLaren garage, Lewis spotted a familiar figure watching from the VIP section. Niki Lauda stood with his arms crossed, but Lewis could see the pride in his mentor's eyes. The man who had secretly funded Lewis's entire career was about to see his investment pay off in the most spectacular way. The formation lap began. Lewis followed the other 19 cars around the track, his hands steady on the steering wheel. Behind him drove some of the greatest racers in the world, drivers who had won championships and races all over the globe. But Lewis didn't feel scared. He felt like he belonged. "Remember, Lewis," came Niki Lauda's voice through the radio. Lauda was now working as an advisor to McLaren. "Drive your own race. Show them what we've known for 10 years, that you're special." The cars lined up on the starting grid. Lewis was in 4th position, which was incredible for a driver in his very first Formula One race. The red lights began to appear above the track. 1 red light, 2 red lights, 3 red lights, 4 red lights, 5 red lights. The lights went out, and the 2007 Australian Grand Prix began. Lewis shot forward like a rocket. By the first corner, he had passed 2 cars and was running 2nd place. The crowd roared so loudly that Lewis could hear them over his screaming engine. "Incredible start, Lewis," his engineer shouted over the radio. For the next 58 laps, Lewis drove the race of his life. He battled with world champions, made passes that had the crowd jumping to their feet, and never put a wheel wrong. When the checkered flag waved, Lewis Hamilton finished 3rd in his very first Formula One race. As Lewis climbed out of his car, he was surrounded by cameras and reporters from around the world. But all he could see was Anthony running toward him from the McLaren garage, tears streaming down his face. "You did it!" Anthony shouted, hugging his son. "You actually did it!" On the podium, Lewis stood between two world champions, holding his bronze trophy high above his head. He looked out at the crowd and thought about the 8-year-old boy who had pressed his face against the McLaren window 14 years ago. "This is for everyone who believed in me when no one else would," Lewis said into his radio. That night, Lewis called Niki Lauda from his hotel room. "Thank you," Lewis said simply, "for everything, for believing in me, for changing my life." "You earned this, Lewis," Lauda replied. "But remember the promise you made me 5 years ago." Lewis hadn't forgotten. 6 months later, he started the Lewis Hamilton Foundation to help underprivileged kids get into motorsport. The very first scholarship went to an 8-year-old girl from Birmingham whose family couldn't afford karting, but whose eyes held the same fire Lewis had once seen in his own mirror. "Why did you choose me?" the little girl asked Lewis when they met. Lewis knelt down to her level, just like Niki Lauda had done with him so many years ago. "Because someone once chose me when I had nothing," Lewis said. "And because I see in your eyes what someone special once saw in mine." The years that followed were like a fairy tale. Lewis won race after race, championship after championship. In 2008, at just 23 years old, he became the youngest Formula One world champion in history, winning the title in the most dramatic finish ever seen. As Lewis crossed the finish line in Brazil to claim his first championship, he radioed his team with tears in his voice. "This is for my dad, who worked 5 jobs to keep my dream alive. This is for everyone from Stevenage who showed me that where you come from doesn't define where you're going. And this is for every kid who's been told their dreams are too big." In the McLaren garage, Anthony sobbed with joy. Ron Dennis applauded, with tears in his eyes. And somewhere in Austria, Niki Lauda smiled with the satisfaction of knowing he had helped create a champion. But Lewis's greatest moment came later that year when he returned to his old primary school in Stevenage. The same school where kids had once made fun of his dreams now invited him as their most famous graduate. "I was sitting in chairs just like yours 15 years ago," Lewis told the children. "I came from the same streets you come from. I lived in a flat smaller than this classroom. If I can make it to Formula One and become world champion, you can achieve anything you dream of." A young boy in the front row raised his hand. "But what if our families don't have money for our dreams?" Lewis smiled, remembering asking that same question so many years ago. "Then you work twice as hard as everyone else," Lewis said. "You never give up, even when things seem impossible. And you remember that sometimes, when you're doing everything right, help comes from places you never expected." After his talk, Lewis drove to his old neighborhood. He parked outside the small flat where he had grown up and walked up the familiar stairs. The building looked exactly the same, but everything else had changed. Marcus Thompson, now retired, from McLaren, was waiting for him there. "Did you ever think it would really happen?" Marcus asked. Lewis looked around at the hallway where he used to run as a boy, dreaming of racing cars. "Every single day," Lewis said. "Even when it seemed completely impossible, I knew it would happen. Because I had people who believed in me before I even believed in myself." They stood together in the quiet hallway, remembering the day a security guard had taken a chance on a boy with holes in his shoes and dreams bigger than his circumstances. "You kept your promise," Marcus said. "You're helping other kids now." Lewis nodded. "That's the most important part." Winning races is amazing, but giving someone else a chance to chase their dreams, that's what really matters. As Lewis walked back to his car, he thought about how far he had traveled from that rainy October day in 1993, from a council flat in Stevenage to the top of the Formula One world, from a boy with nothing to a man who could change other people's lives. Lewis Hamilton had learned that dreams really do come true, but only when you find people who believe in you as much as you believe in yourself. The boy who once pressed his face against a window, dreaming of driving the fastest cars in the world, had become the man who proved that anything is possible when you refuse to give up. And in keeping his promise to Niki Lauda, Lewis had become something even more important than a world champion. He had become someone else's guardian angel, just like Niki had been his. The journey from nothing to everything was complete, but the journey of helping others had just begun. The secret that Niki Lauda believed in Lewis before anyone else knew. His name proves that sometimes guardian angels come in the most unexpected forms. I'm curious, where are you listening from today? Drop your location in the comments below. I love connecting with viewers from all around the world. If this story inspired you or left you speechless like it did me, please hit that like button. It really helps spread these amazing stories to more people who need to hear them. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for many more incredible stories like this one. We share tales of triumph, hope, and the power of believing in dreams that seem impossible. Most importantly, please share this video with your friends and family. Stories like Lewis's remind us that kindness, belief, and giving someone a chance can literally change the world. When we spread these messages of hope and determination, we create more opportunities for the next Lewis Hamilton out there. Until next time, keep dreaming big. And never forget, your circumstances don't define your destiny. See you in the next story.